I will make a small digression. In the sufficiently general theory of control, we will consider categories such as management goals, the vector of goals, that is, achieving management goals, and the stability of management. Why am I saying this? Right now we will be talking, and without mastering this apparatus, of the sufficiently general theory of control. It will initially seem quite difficult to perceive. But later, when we consider the main provisions of the sufficiently general theory of control, I will still remind you that right now we are speaking, especially for those who are watching these lectures for the first time and do not know the terminological apparatus of the sufficiently general theory of control. That is, the goal of management always implies a certain objective. There is no such thing as aimless management. It can be good or bad, but as long as there is information transfer, it always has a certain goal. Therefore, based even on those simplest things we just discussed about the meaning of people's lives, if there is a certain informational influence from the universe upon us, it must have a goal. And so, based on this, what are the reflections on the meaning of people's lives? The existence of a person and humanity is not meaningless, but has a certain purpose. Thus, this purpose is determined by both the specific matrix of possible states of the biosphere of planet Earth and the general universal order. That is, we are subjected to the controlling influence of the laws of nature, of the informational state that affects us, both from the biosphere itself and from all the rhythms of the cosmos, both the individuality of a person and their purpose, as I have already said. Each person has their own fingerprint. This means that each person is a child of God. There are no identical people. And the meaning of life for each person definitely exists. That is, the existence of each person is not meaningless, and the existence of humanity as a whole, as a certain supersystem, is also not meaningless. But now running ahead and finding out the purpose for which you exist. But who can you know the purpose for? God. But for this, you need to enter into a dialogue with Him. That is, to enter, using the language of radio engineering, into coherence. That is what in the terminology of priests, our church, well, religious figures, means the acquisition of the Holy Spirit. This will also be discussed in a fairly general theory of control. Since a person's abilities are genetically determined, this is equivalent to the genetic conditioning of the entire social organization of people who carry a certain culture. Well, that is what I said. The existence of both a person and humanity as a whole is not meaningless, but has a certain purpose. Therefore, all of this that we have said distinguishes humanity, that is, speech and thinking. Thus, labor, the realization of one's intentions in work, all of this distinguishes humanity from the animal world, and therefore humanity can do two things. Since it can intervene, we can intervene in nature, thus to build a type of culture that is acceptable for the Creator's design, that is, for God to realize His intentions here, or perish, giving rise to a culture that is unacceptable for people and hierarchically superior, encompassing governance. That is what I said. You cannot go against God. That is, either we will realize the goals that the Almighty had in creating us and everyone, or we will act against His will, carrying out our actions without aligning with His purpose. Well, as I say, as the people say, you cannot go against God. Here. Well, to conclude this thought, let's put it this way, a question for each of you who is watching: how are we living right now? And we are going against it. That is, the entire culture in which we live oppresses both genetics and destroys the biosphere, and there may be a collapse when human existence is threatened. Well, after what has been said, let's consider types of culture. Thus, a new type of rational human entered the previously existing animal world. That is, when that very first human appeared, possessing all the qualities that we currently have, he entered the previously existing animal world. Therefore, his worldview and skills were animalistic, meaning he was guided by instincts. Remember this, and compare it to what we have already discussed in the introductory lecture regarding types of psyche. Animal structure of psyche, biobot, demon, and intuition, that is, human structures of psyche. And these skills were similar to the skills of his ancestors, the proto-humans. That is, what we have just said and recalled, namely conditional instincts, unconditional instincts, reflexes, and that was all. He had nothing more. But unlike animals, those proto-humans, thus a human, unlike animals, already had a genetically determined potential. That is, here is genetics, and that genetically determined potential that he was to master. Moreover, to master it with the development of culture. So here is a schematic representation of the genetically determined potential for cultural development. He was to master this. Thus, a note. This point of view is confirmed by archaeological data. That is, there are others, namely the myth of the Greek fall of knowledge in Israel, the myth of the flood, a catastrophe after which the survivors, all of this exists. But the point of view we expressed aligns with archaeological data. Moreover, the latest excavations known through journals and newspapers confirm this thesis. In the broadest sense, humanity can carry three types of culture and live for some time in three types of civilization. The first, this is a technocratic civilization and culture. What does it mean? It is modern to us. We live in it, in a technocratic one. What characterizes it in the broadest sense? Humanity has become a slave to the technology it has created. That is, just imagine now if in Moscow, for example, or in some large city, what if electricity stops? Water disappears. Heating batteries don't heat. What will happen? Can you imagine what that would be? That is, we are hostages. Some can no longer move, eat, or do anything without technology, so to speak. That's it. In this sense, people have become humanoid robots. They are not free. They are subjected to this technocratic civilization. That is, it controls them, not the person. It dominates and shapes its activities, and he is already subordinated to the rhythm of this technosphere. Technological. What is its characteristic here? Technicians need people. They dominate over them. This means that people must have a different type of psyche. Finally, the third type of culture, when biological culture is oriented towards mastering the genetically determined potential of human capabilities. A person lives in harmony with the biosphere, managing without technological prosthetics. Well, an example of this was Porfiry Kornevich Ivan. Remember, he lived in harmony with nature, bathed, breathed, walked barefoot across Russia, and so on. That is, he lived in harmony with the biosphere, subordinating his activities to the rhythms of the biosphere, the cosmos, and so on. If biological civilizations existed on Earth before, there should be practically no traces of them, but myths remain. Myths about the Golden Age, about the expulsion from paradise after the Greek fall, if the civilization was a biological civilization. And then, if it was so, we do not know for sure, then we are rebuilding. So, this type of civilization, we approach it while still being in a technocratic civilization and culture. And after what we have considered, questions should arise. The first one, what is good in the development of culture? Look at all aspects of our life now, where we live, and ask yourself, is it good for a person to master what is inherent in them, what we call genetically determined potential, or is it the opposite, not good? For example, a person has a brain, and you know people who can calculate well there, perform operations quickly. The vast majority are using computers now. When I served at the Baikonur Cosmodrome, I remember a case when they launched Japanese astronauts. So there was a journalist who flew, and the woman who was with him got appendicitis. She had surgery there at the military hospital at the Cosmodrome. So the Japanese, they were already without a calculator back then. I watched them there as we integrated communication systems. They wanted to initially transmit information through our communication systems, that is, broadcast to Japan. But then they abandoned that. There was in particular a moment when attenuation is measured in Nepers, and they already had personal calculators, while we still had nothing, those computers. With what horror they looked at that lieutenant who took a logarithmic slide rule out of his pocket and started calculating those attenuations using the slide rule. Even when they bought a buffet or something there, they only did it in person. In other words, they, roughly speaking, can no longer do such arithmetic operations as 2 + 2 in their heads. So, instead of developing what is inherent in us by nature, we instead create prosthetics everywhere. Therefore, we need to see what is good in the development of culture and what is not. Even relating to this, now the technocratic civilization technological, one can use the same personal computer, which in principle is fine now, meaning it can be used normally. But when a child is from childhood, he doesn't get out of there, meaning he doesn't see the surrounding world. His world is limited by the confines of the personal computer, the screen, and beyond that he can't even imagine what is happening sitting there from morning till night. He is a hostage to this. He cannot manage without it. So, what needs to be eradicated? That is, here are two questions. What is good in the development of culture, and what needs to be eradicated in order to realize genetically determined potential? Next, let's consider the question of the formation of individual characteristics of a person. Here is a simple picture. A little person is born and he grows, becoming older. And what about the cultural environment or culture? What we call it shapes the physical and spiritual personality of a person. This primarily occurs from conception to the transition into adulthood. So, a person is influenced by family, that is, nurseries, kindergartens, schools, parents, teachers, books, fairy tales, radio, and so on. What influences the formation of a person? And what ideals do fairy tales, music, and books carry? If good ideals are instilled, a good person emerges. If bad ideals are instilled, well, now compare what ideals we instill in people. Take everything from life, drink beer, and so on, and then what comes out is, so to speak, an underdeveloped being, a textual digestive apparatus. And from the perspective of influence from conception, this is, I must say, a serious point until the transition into adulthood. What happens through the Trinity? Many believe that a child should be raised only after birth. This is a serious mistake. Why? Because the child's emergence and the formation does not begin at the moment he appears in the world from the mother's womb, but starts from the moment of conception. Why? Because a child is not produced from the fusion of sperm with egg cells, but also from the interaction of the bioplasmas of two loving people. And if at the moment of conception, the bioplasmas of two people come into contact, they reflect on this future person. That is why in Russia they sought to preserve the chastity of the girl, because if a girl had physical interactions with several men before conceiving, that child, this bioplasmic interaction affects her child. This phenomenon is called telegony when, well, there are facts from the animal world, even from human life, when, for example, there was such a case with a graduate student at Moscow State University. She had a boyfriend before, a black man from Africa, and then, when she married a white man, that is, a Russian, the black man had been in Africa for a long time, meaning he hadn't been there for 9 months, which is proven. Yet she gave birth to a black baby. Why? Because her biophysical field reflected that sexual interaction of biophysical fields when she had intercourse with that black man, and a black child appeared. The same goes for the mating of a zebra and a horse. It does not produce offspring. When a horse is mated with a zebra, there is no offspring. But when a horse mates with another horse, or rather a stallion, if it had previously mated with a zebra, zebra foals are often born. That is, informational influences. Horses are striped, so to speak. I expressed myself incorrectly, because during this mating, I repeat, it is not only the mechanical merging of sperm and egg cells, but also the connection of biophysical fields. And that's why it often happens that parents don't even know who you were born from. And he was born with all those. That is, the men with whom the woman had intercourse before. So he has many fathers. But this in general also applies to men. So this has an impact. Therefore, conception is an important moment for a new person. So we have literature on this matter. Interested readers can read more about it on our website. That is, we say that culture shapes a person, and primarily this is reflected before entering adulthood. Therefore, it is very important to assess a person by judging who their parents were, in what environment they were raised, how they learned there, and so on. That is, the childhood period is very important, and a person's psychological makeup is formed precisely during this time. After that, well, it is certainly possible, but in general it is very difficult to change further. That is why it is so important to invest initially. Again, as you recall, if Vaneshka didn't learn, Ivan even won't learn. This moment is very important, and at this time we have no business with the child, so why are you distracting me, and so on. That is, there are no grandmothers or grandfathers because they live separately. Why do we say that we need to live in continuity of generations? So that the accumulated experience is passed on to the child. Parents go to work, and nearby are the grandmother and grandfather, but our apartments are such that you can't live together. Moreover, the culture is such that one would rather escape from parents somewhere. In this sense, Russians lose out in particular to those who live in the Caucasus. You see how they respect their elders there? They listen to their opinions. Although now this also has a largely declarative nature, nevertheless, traditions and culture exist, and ours has all been destroyed, including culture, architecture, and so on. So there is much to talk about in this picture. This is a very serious moment. Here we have schools, kindergartens, teacher salaries, what education should be like, and what should be given to children. In other words, there is a lot. Well, let's move on. But this formation occurs based on the individual matrix of genetically determined potential. That is, the formation of a person is not only under this, but he is a child of God, and therefore here is a little person drawn. He has a genetically determined potential. Every person is unique, so each one has their own genetically determined potential. And they can either master it, either they didn't give him enough here, they didn't tell him, they didn't explain this to him, and so he mastered but before that, you see, he didn't reach all of this. It is appropriate to remind about the circumcision of the foreskin specifically on the 8th day. Here, circumcision occurs, and all of this is about cutting off mastery. That is, this affects a person's mastery of genetically determined potential, and in particular in the Bible. This is what is said, and they will come out of here not distinguishing between the concepts of good and evil. What a terrible tool! And in general, what was done in the Code of the Sinai Pilgrimage, well, speaking of this matrix, one can also consider another, this genetically determined potential of a person. Here is his matrix of possible developmental states. It is conditioned. The matrix of the biosphere, and it is conditioned by the biorhythms of the cosmos, that is, it does not exist on its own. It lives in a multi-dimensional matrix, including the matrix of the biosphere and the matrix of the cosmos. And in this sense, speaking of fate, every person is born, as astrologers used to say, under certain oscillatory processes. Not only birth occurs, but conception also happens. Not just during the union of egg cells with sperm and biopole fields. Two loving people, if they truly conceive a new person, but also those biorhythms that exist in the cosmos. That is, astrologers should take this into account, not only the moment of birth, but also the moment of conception of a person. This is also necessary since all these rhythms have an effect, as you can see. The influence on the formation of a person, and further, that is, a person has probabilistic predetermination, what is called fate. But this fate is not such that a step to the left or a step to the right means you can't escape. Nothing like that. A person can change their fate within the limits of this universal matrix. Therefore, this also needs to be known. That is, you shouldn't think that if a fortune teller predicted something, then that's it. What has been predicted for you can be changed, and fundamentally changed. It is important to be able to manage not only yourself, but also events. And it is also important to always be in dialogue with God. That's it. That is, genetically determined potential is also a certain private measure that needs to be filled with real content throughout life. Well, you need to build your life in such a way that you can master what is given to you by God 100%. And now let's compare ourselves, acquaintances, and so on. Are we mastering all of this 100%? Of course not. Why? Because the entire culture does not support this. We weren't given this, we didn't read that, we don't know this, we can't do that, and therefore we find ourselves in such a... Moreover, what I have described is largely determined astrologically, that is, by the influence of the rhythms of the earth and the cosmos on humans. What conclusions can we draw from what we have discussed? Human abilities must be developed in a timely manner. Again, a proverb, you see, if Vaneshka Ivan hasn't learned, you won't teach him. Here, again, is the school, the nursery, so to speak, parents, children's books, and other aspects of the culture we live in. The genetic program sets strict time norms and limits for a person to master something. Remember, we have already discussed Mowgli. Remember, I told you about Mowgli when a child was raised by animals and when he was taken back. At the age of 10, 12, it turns out it is impossible to teach him to speak. He is a human. He has a brain, a language, eyes, ears, everything, but he cannot speak. Why? Because genetics has set a strict time limit for a person to master something. Therefore, this moment of a person's development into adulthood is very important. That is, when he masters everything. And if there are no necessary conditions in the habitat during a certain period, it all leads to a disruption of genetically determined potential. Well, now, if we look at children in Russia, look at how many homeless children there are. They will enter life. And then, like Professor Dobrenkov, when Sasha was killed, if you remember, who is to blame? Well, these criminals, it seems, are they really criminals? These kids whom all this culture, all these democratizers and so on have thrown out onto the streets, they are the result of the management of that immoral culture. I always remember the song from the movie The Generals of the Sand Quarries in this sense. Do you remember the lines, "Why did you abandon me? Why, after all, I am your brother, I am a human. When you caressed your children, I wanted to eat, I was freezing." And these people, who are indeed deprived of much, they do not know. And these wealthy ones want them to be good and accept their fate. They will never accept it. And what has formed in them, they express in relation to Sasha Matvey, Professor Dobrenkov. So can you imagine what generation is being prepared now? If necessary measures are not taken, what society will it be? And they have built so many fences, prison romanticism, all these castles with spikes, with fences, with barbed wire, with watchtowers, and with machine guns. And Is this what people are? It's some kind of nonsense, some kind of culture. That is, when people guard themselves from each other. In general, if it comes to that, we are already in the third millennium, and people are killing each other in wars and so on. This is the satanic concept we are talking about. Let's talk about national cultures. With the emergence of the species Homo sapiens, in conditions of zero or near zero cultural level, the initial paths of development were determined by matrices of genetically conditioned potential capabilities. And here it is depicted that the Earth, well, a fragment of the planet, well, and it is conditionally stated like this. This is the matrix of the development of all humanity. And what about nationalities? Well, here in Europe, we won't name them. Here is the potential in Europe. Here is the potential in Russia, and here is the potential in Japan, genetically conditioned potential. All of this is within the hierarchically highest encompassing management, that is God. But the possibilities were different. This includes the theory of Gumilev, which is the theory of ethnogenesis. He says that the determining and sole factor in the formation of man and culture was the environment in which he lived. Yes, Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev is right in this, that of course the environment influences the formation of a person. But if only the environment has an influence, then Lev Nikolaevich Gumilev deprives man of reason, deprives him of the environment, deprives him of culture, deprives him of management, and so on, and that is already incorrect. And in the concept of dead water, this is detailed. For those interested, read it. Of course, there is a difference in a person who is raised in the desert. He looks where? Beyond the horizon. What is there beyond the horizon? Those who are in the forest are in the forest. Trees, where does he look? Up to the stars. That is, the relief of the terrain does have an influence on a person. But a person's behavior is not determined only by this, it is determined by the culture in which he lives. And culture is managed. So, what am I getting at? So, in this picture, the genetically determined possibilities were different, and the adaptation also took different paths, influenced by many factors. And in this sense, what is the difference between these matrices that existed? Look, in Japan there is the sea all around, an island, they are limited. Yes, there are mountains and so on. Let's take Russia. And in Russia, there are mountains, deserts, forests, seas, rivers, lakes, fields, and plains. That is, we have. So, from the perspective of formation, the measures of adaptation to the universal measure are much greater. And that's why the Russian language, for example, is much richer. Well, let's say, what do they call a girl in England? Gel. And that's it. But how is it with Russians? Girl, little girl, young woman, maiden, and so on. What is this? These are different shades.